Now, the next topic is actually an extremely important one, and it's probably the main reason why people want to vote to leave, and that is sovereignty. Take back control. I want my country back. A lot of people feel that they are not governed anymore by the people that they have elected, but by unelected, faceless bureaucrats in Brussels that are governing over them. Some people even go as far as to say, you know what, the EU is the Fourth Reich, it's a conspiracy, it's a dictatorship, and like in the glorious days of the Second World War, we have to free ourselves from that tyranny. Now, I ask these people always the same thing. Can you name me one regulation of the EU that is so damaging to your life that you're talking about the Fourth Reich, and that you want to leave the single market and take a lot of economic pain in return for that sovereignty? Now, I don't know, is it the EU directive on handheld mixers, or is it EU regulation on allowed bedsheet chemicals? Which one is it? And usually most people don't really know, they can't really tell what exactly is their problem, and they just know that somehow the EU is big, is evil, and is a tyranny. They don't know exactly how they're being suppressed, but they know they are suppressed. And this is really something which I think we have to take the hyperbole a bit out of it, because I mean 95% of what the EU does is extremely dull technical product and market regulation. And what it is just that you have these 28 democratic European countries who decided to outsource all that dull regulation to a central body. So at least it's the same for everyone, because then at least you have only one bureaucrat, and of course, yes, he's well paid, but you share him with 28 other countries, and at least you also, it's consistent. Once you have understood the regulation, you can export to 500 million consumers, and you don't have to learn a new regulation each time you export to another country. So if you leave, it's not that, you know, suddenly the House of Commons will debate the handheld mixer directive. What will happen is that you replace unelected, faceless bureaucrat in Brussels with an unelected, faceless bureaucrat in London now doing your regulation here. That's all that's going to happen. And the difference is the salary of that unelected, faceless bureaucrat is now fully paid by your own government and not just the share. The other aspect I think a lot of people are saying is that, yeah, okay, true, most of the stuff the EU is doing very technical, but it's changing. So I mean, you've seen that during the Eurozone crisis, how all these countries like Greece, Portugal, Spain were, you know, they had brutal austerity programs imposed on them. And that's true. Now, but what happened is basically that the Eurozone has taken the role of the IMF. So normally when a country goes bankrupt anywhere in the world, you have the IMF stepping in, and they give loans to this country so that it can still pay its bills, but in return they agree reform programs with this country with the goal to make it competitive again so that it can continue again to pay its bills by itself. Now in the Eurozone, that role has been partially taken over by the Eurozone countries themselves. So instead of the IMF alone coming in and bailing out and agreeing reform programs, the Eurozone stepped in the case of Greece, Portugal, Spain, who all had problems because of the global financial crisis, which hit countries all over the world. And from that perspective, it's nothing extraordinary. It's something that happens every time. I mean, there's no country in the world that stays sovereign if it goes bankrupt. You always have someone who then helps you out, and for that help you give up some of your sovereignty until you are able to pay your bills again. That's the same for countries, and it's the same for people. If you go bankrupt, you know, you have also then suddenly legal obligations towards your debtors. So from that perspective, this is nothing extraordinary. And if you have the choice of being bailed out by your neighbors or being bailed out by a faceless, unelected bureaucracy in Washington, which is the IMF, then maybe you still prefer to be bailed out by your neighbors, with whom you at least have some things in common. You have some leverage. You're in the same organization. Then there is talk about things will change in the future. So the EU may turn into a super state with an EU army. Now, the good thing about the UK's membership of the European Union is that it's very special. So you're like the special kid in the club, and you have a lot of opt-outs. In particular, this is something that David Cameron negotiated, is that you have to opt out of ever closer union. So if the European Union decides to take such steps to really form a nation, then you have the possibility to opt out of that and say you don't want to make this step. And I mean, even if, you know, I mean, there's people who say, I don't see how, but there's people who say, oh yeah, that opt-out is worth nothing, they can still force us. I mean, the European Union cannot force you to do anything, really. You know, if really things go bad, you vote in a UKIP government, which makes another referendum, and you're out. So you can always go out. So, you know, from that perspective, for something that may happen and that might be bad, because I mean it could be good as well, to commit economic suicide and get into an economic crisis because you leave the single market, doesn't seem to me like the pragmatic approach that I usually know English people for. I mean, for something theoretical to make such a dramatic step seems like a bit exaggerated. Then the last point a lot of people forget is that, you know, if you leave, you're on your own. And in Switzerland we know what that can mean. So, for example, we rejected in 1992 the European Economic Area Treaty, and that would have given us the right to secure our airports so that we can fly over other countries' territory without being stopped to do that. Now, we were suddenly bullied by Germany because there were people in southern Germany and the Zurich airport had planes flying over their territory, and they complained about the noise. And they managed to lobby their government in Berlin, who then imposed a ban on our airplanes to fly across that area. And as a result, planes had to start over Swiss territory, which was much more densely populated. So from an objective point of view, this made no sense at all. But because we needed their airspace, they could impose that. Because it's Germany, they can do these things with smaller countries like us. Now, of course, you will say, yeah, haha, but we are the UK, we are not a small country. And of course, yes, you're bigger than we are a much bigger country. You're even so big and so powerful that you bullied us as well. Actually, the UK has bullied Switzerland into changing its tax laws and ending its famous banking secrecy for Swiss citizens. So for UK residents, if you open a Swiss bank account, there's no more banking secrecy. So the Swiss bank is then obliged by law to send information about that British resident to HMRC, or they can apply a withholding tax at source and send the money to HMRC. So it's as if HMRC had a hand in every Swiss bank. Now, of course, the Swiss didn't like that at all. And there was a lot of debate at the time. We have to strike back, we have to boycott the UK. We should stop their banks from trading in Switzerland. And I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, like Switzerland threatening the UK. Would you have sleepless nights? Do you think your newspapers would be full of headlines? Switzerland is threatening us with boycott. Do you think when the Swiss Prime Minister, whose name you probably don't know, comes to the UK and to number 10 Downing Street, that then everybody will get nervous? What you're probably having at the moment is a physical reaction of shoulder shrugging, like, why would you feel threatened, Like I mean, it's Switzerland. I mean, what are they going to do? Are they going to throw cuckoo clocks at us? And the problem with that is that from the perspective of Washington, Brussels, Beijing, you are Switzerland. The UK is as much bigger as Switzerland than these countries are bigger than the UK. I mean, for example, in the United States, you take two states, California and Washington, and together they have a bigger economy than the entire United Kingdom. 7 out of 23 Chinese provinces have more inhabitants than the entire United Kingdom. Even if you leave the EU, the rest of the EU is still going to be its economy will still be 5 times bigger than yours, which is exactly as much bigger as you are compared to Switzerland. So if you have this shoulder shrugging, you can imagine that if you then complain about bullying and you try to strike trade deals and you try to get your way, you will get exactly the same shoulder shrugging in Washington, Beijing and Brussels. And I know this is not something you like to hear. I know it's a much greater message when people tell you, you should be optimistic, we should believe in ourselves, etc. But unfortunately, there is a reality out there, and the reality is that when it comes to countries, David usually does not win against Goliath. It's usually Goliath who wins. And you will experience that sooner or later, because you have obviously a lot of things that there are, powers out there which they will want. I mean, you have the leading global financial center in the world, and there are a lot of people in Paris, Frankfurt, and New York who would like that business in their cities. And as we experienced, where where several countries actually have, through these imposed tax laws, have dramatically shrunk Switzerland's wealth management industry. The same can happen to you anytime, and that's then not really sovereignty anymore. When you're on your own, alone in the wild, and you can anytime fall victim to the next bully around. And this is another thing that what the European Union is about. I mean, it's like in the schoolyard when you're a small kid and you have the big kids around, the big bully around in the schoolyard. What can you do? I mean, you can't fight him because he's gonna knock you down every time. So, but what you can do is you can gang up with the other small kids. And this is exactly what the European Union is about. I mean, in trade, where the European Union unites and finds a single voice, for example, in the trade area, nobody's messing with the European Union, because they know that if the European Union imposes tariffs or imposes punitive import duties, then it will hurt, because altogether all these little kids from Europe are actually quite a big kid themselves. So this is maybe also a thought to take. And I know that a lot of British people say, yeah, but you know what, we have nothing in common with these Europeans. We would rather be another state of America. And people who say that usually have never been outside Europe, because of course we have our differences, but they are nothing compared to the fundamental differences you have with countries outside of Europe. I mean, it's obvious that a communist dictatorship like China is very different, also culturally. But even the United States of America is a different planet. And I mean, it's people who maybe go to New York and then think, oh, that's a bit like London. But it's not that the UK is like America because it looks a bit like New York. It's the other way around. New York is European. it's the biggest European city because its whole lifestyle and the way people live, have transportation, what they eat, the fashion is mainly European, and that's the absolute exception. You go to the rest of the United States, and it's a different world where people debate about gun control, where they debate whether evolution is actually the right theory to explain the species, where they have culture war on abortion rights. I mean, it's a different planet, and if David Cameron was a politician in the US, he would probably be called a socialist, and if and the Europeans share so much in political convictions of, I mean, all Europeans care about some social protection. It's not the case in in the US. You have a lot of people which say it's totally okay that people starve if they don't have a job. You hardly ever see that in Europe. All Europeans care about protecting the environment. Most Europeans are not really keen on ruling the world because we have had too much issues with that ourselves. And again, that's different. In America, people are, America feels entitled to rule the world and to run the world, and they want to run the world. The Chinese also have this mentality of, we are normally the country, the kingdom of the middle, we are supposed to rule the world. It's just that these Westerners had a bit of a good time, but now we are coming back. And we Europeans, we don't really care about these things anymore. We just want to have security, we want to have prosperity, we believe in the rule of law, and I think there are a lot of things we have in common and on which we can base a policy on. And I think it's a good thing that a continent that has made so much experiences has also its voice heard, and that it has a powerful voice in the world, because I still think that the European voice would be a force for good in the world, and I think it's needed. So that's maybe also something to consider before you vote to leave.